Hi everyone, and welcome to a new bonus episode of Tolkien About It, where we're going to be discussing diversity within Tolkien's universe. Unfortunately, Robert couldn't join us today due to some family commitments that he couldn't move, but to make up for it, we have some incredible guests, Eric Silver and Robin Walker. Just a quick warning before we get into this episode, it's a little bit heavier and more serious than our usual bonus content, so if you do want to skip it, it's not going to break our hearts. But I do hope you listen to it. We have some really good conversations and some really cool information. So let's go ahead and get into it and start out with our first guest, Eric Silver.
Hello, that's me.
Welcome to the podcast. I am so excited you agreed to come on with us.
Listen, you threw up the bat signal and was like, hey, do you want to talk about Jews in fantasy and how that happens and how that's reverberated over genres ad infinitum? And I'm like, yes, please. I definitely want to talk about that.
And I'm so excited because the way this all happened was we mentioned it in our last episode about the dwarves and how there's Jewish coding there. And then I happened to be listening to a Potterless episode that you were on where you guys also mentioned it. So I wrote you an email out of the blue and you said yes to come talk about it, which I'm very excited for because as a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant myself, a WASP, I don't really know that much about it. And I'm only a casual Tolkien fan, so I'm learning the books for the first time and learning about the world for the first time, so I'm really excited to dive into it and learn more about it.
Yeah, I mean, similarly, I'm happy to use my Jewishness to just come in and be like, hey, no, let's talk about this now, which is how I feel going into Potterless. But it's, for once, I don't want to say for once, J.K. Rowling is trafficking in exactly the same genre of fantasy. Even if this is like teen wizards, the tradition of wizards really does come from J.R.R. Tolkien, but it's also worth saying that she's also buying from a different sort of genre, which is like blank Nazis. It's like, so because these are like wizard Nazis, this is like in Star Wars, like the Empire are space Nazis. So this whole like coding in whatever genre you're doing and then taking minorities from the real world happens in all types of genres all over the place. So we can be talking about YA, we can be talking about high fantasy, or we can be talking about sci-fi fantasy like Star Wars. That it's all really the same. We'll see.
Yeah, in J.K. Rowling's universe, it's very much wizard Nazis.
Yeah, for sure. The trope that we're talking about is usually just called like space Jews or space and then insert minority, because like when you're coming up with aliens, it is just as much as you're coming up with a whole fantasy race. But then it's like, oh, look at this alien. This is an alien and not a black person. It's not an alien or a Jew. It's all these other things. So I refer to this trope as space Jews, but it also applies to fantasy, and that colors literally every single thing that has any sort of magic comes from Lord of the Rings. I run a Dungeons & Dragons podcast, Join the Party, so I see this all the time because Dungeons & Dragons just ripped 50 to 70% of all of their monsters from Tolkien directly. So at least like the monster manual might as well just be Tolkien monsters and then with new names.
Yeah, Tolkien just influenced D&D and fantasy culture so much that pretty much everywhere you look, either people are copying him and doing something similar, or they're just doing the exact opposite, trying to not be like him.
Yes, exactly. We'll get to that. I definitely want to talk about the reverberations, but I'd love for you to walk me through the Tolkien's biography and background, because I know that you did so much research on this, and like I know this ambiently, so I really just want to hear like the details from you.
Yeah, so Tolkien was a hardcore Catholic. He was raised Catholic since birth. His mother actually converted to Catholicism and was pretty much disowned from her family for it. And so when Tolkien was orphaned at a pretty young age, instead of going to live with family, he was actually sent to a Catholic orphanage. And that's where he eventually met his future wife, was there as well. And he's just this incredible Catholic guy who even wrote a translation for one of the Catholic Bibles. And he's even said that one of his greatest regrets in life is that his best friend C.S. Lewis was a Protestant instead of a Catholic.
Of course. He was extremely Protestant. He was so Protestant that he made Jesus into a lion and let him do everything.
I actually come from like a pretty Catholic background. My family on my mother's side is very Catholic. So, and then I'm Protestant, so I can kind of relate to this dynamic.
Every so often I hear like a new fact about Catholicism, like something wild a pope did, and I'm like, why was he allowed to do that? Why is the king of why is the guy who's supposed to be representing Catholicism being like, I need a mustard man? Give me a man who only tells me about mustard and gives me mustard. Like, do you need that, really?
There's actually an amazing Smithsonian Channel documentary series about different popes, and it's wild. There's so much things that the popes did. My favorite is there was 3 different popes at one point that all excommunicated each other. It was wild.
Oh, for sure. I do like finding out things about Christianity, like, randomly, because it's always a surprise. I recently found out how short Mass was, and I am still losing my mind. It's an hour? It's 1 hour.
Yeah, it's an hour, but sometimes it's longer, sometimes it's shorter. I've been to some Catholic masses that just seem to go on and on forever, but the Protestant ones, they try to keep it at an hour, nice, short, and sweet. But I have a friend who is Russian Orthodox, and those can be like 4-hour-long services.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So, like, pretty much all Shabbat services are like at least 2.5. Like, even Reform, which is mostly in English and it's very liberal, it's still long. You still gotta like do everything, and then you read the Torah, and then there's a thing after reading the Torah. Like, all of them are long. I found that out recently. I told my grandmother, and she's like, "What?" She also thought that was funny. So no, I would like to just figure this out. Have Christianity just like speckled into my life and surprising me.
That's so interesting. When I was in college, I decided to take a history of world religions class just because I wanted to just learn about different religions and understand them.
I do feel that way about religions that I don't know a lot about. And I'm like, oh, this tradition sounds sick. I love this. This food sounds amazing. This holiday sounds amazing. But it's more like, oh, wow, I live in like a Christian country and this is what you guys do? Like, I don't know what Episcopalian is. That was a thing people fought over? What was Thomas Jefferson? So it's like in a little different way, but I agree. I understand what you're talking about. But it's more like figuring out what people consider normal is like, wow, I'm very surprised.
So yeah, Tolkien was just very, very Catholic, and he definitely wrote his Catholic beliefs into his books, not necessarily on purpose, but the influence is definitely there.
So here is my question, because I get a lot of this. My understanding is that there's a lot of like good and evil themes that are depicted similarly, like it is in Christianity. It's like the lightness of God, the good people, they're all white and good, and then like literally darkness, black, like the orcs are the embodiment of evil and all that stuff. And I don't know enough to speak directly knowledgeable about that, but I know that's like the fantasy racism. It's like dark skin is bad. But like, did this come? I want to know where this came from specifically. Like, did this also come from like World War I? Like, is this an allegory? I guess this is what I'm trying to get my head around. And then why Tolkien decided to make the dwarves so explicitly Jewish.
Yeah, so Tolkien has explicitly stated that the dwarves are coded Jewish. He said in a 1964 BBC interview that, hey, the dwarves are coded Jewish. Isn't that neat? Like, it's almost like he wanted cookie points for it, for including them. And he said that he didn't want to do any bad stereotypes. He wanted to create good stereotypes. But should we even have those stereotypes is the big question that comes up.
Right. my understanding, and please correct me on this, because I just as much came in for you to tell me these things as well, is like, so Tolkien fought in World War One. He saw the horrors and the good versus evil thing, and I feel like in World War One, you really see this is where the affording to white Europeans, you really saw people striated as like nationalities and stuff. It's like the British, we're on the side of good and we're fighting the Imperials and all of that. And then like the Jews are just kind of like sprinkled in there and they're like the Semitic race, right? So then when he wrote The Hobbit, which we know was like a kind of just a children's story for his sons, is that like, I'm gonna make these gruff people, these gruff and who are kind of nice and kind of gruff and speak differently and live underground and have giant beards. Like, these are the Jews that hang out with all the British people, the hobbits, right? And then after World War II, when the Holocaust happened, he's like, oh no, I should be nicer to Jews. And then the dwarves, epitomized by Gimli in the Lord of the Rings books, then they're like good Jews.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tolkien, he hadn't quite fleshed out the dwarves yet when he was writing The Hobbit, because like you mentioned, it was more of a children's book. But once The Lord of the Rings came out, he was very intentionally writing them as Jewish. And with Gimli kind of comes off as the token dwarf, where he's the only dwarf on the journey. He's very different than what we see in The Hobbit. He's more interested in the journey and honor and helping along this journey for the fate of the world versus trying to reclaim a bunch of gold. And it's almost like he wants cookie points for it, because he's like, hey, I made these awesome dwarves as Jews and made them the heroes of the story. Isn't that neat? And I do want to mention that Tolkien was very anti-Nazi. Back when The Hobbit was going to be translated into German, he very explicitly said, hey, no, I'm not going to let it happen because I don't agree with what the Nazi Party is doing to the Jews right now.
Yes, I saw that. The letter he sent was kind of weird, though. And when you're talking about good stereotypes, it was like, no, I know good Jews. I've written them. They're the dwarves. They're the good guys. So I feel like it's also kind of funny because of the difference between The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. It's like you have Bilbo Baggins, who's just like, yeah, I hung out with these rough guys who like annoyed me as I tried to go do the stuff that I did in The Hobbit. And then Frodo was like, what? I met their grandchildren. They were fine. What do you mean? So it's really, it's doesn't like pull the stereotype away. It's like, no, you didn't meet the good ones. And because Gimli is like way far from home and everything, it's like he is, like you said, the odd man out. So when it comes to stereotyping, I don't want super British Tolkien telling me what are good and not good Jews. I think that's the problem, is that like he is the one to be like, no, I've met them. This is what a good Jew looks like, who is friends with his elven companion and has like fun banter and is just like a fun guy with a hammer. What's also funny because he doesn't care about he doesn't like the explicit Aryan is like white power of the Nazis, but like the elves are like super the pinnacle of the white race, the Aryan Ubermensch, which is wild that he put that in there anyway. It's like, look at this white guy. He has great blonde hair. He's never gonna age. He's super good at everything. He's super hot. Like, and then it's like, and then there's Gimli.
Yeah, so in future Tolkien works that never was published in his lifetime, but from writings that his publisher and his son collected, he basically explained that they're kind of like angels almost. This very majestic, otherworldly, greater than the humans, but not quite gods, is kind of the way that he portrayed the elves.
Right. But it's like yeah, I mean, then you can explain, but that's like commentary on white people, which feels so like, or Christian white British people that he's doing this thing on. Like, that's the kind of like balance between the orcs and the elves, right? I mean, I don't know enough of the Silmarillion and all that stuff, but it's like they feel like they're the two sides of the same of the coin, the explicitly white good and the explicitly black bad. And then it's like Jews are kind of existing in this other way. It's like they can exist and they're fun, but they need to stay underground. Gimli is the only one who's kind of allowed, and like they're not heroes necessarily. They're just like extensions of the plot.
It's interesting you mention that, because that's something that Tolkien has actually said, is dwarves are not heroes. They are not the heroes. They just are. They're just there. They are on the side of good, but they are certainly tempted by the bad side in The Lord of the Rings, though they do eventually go on the good side. And it's more of like they're just there. They're not the heroes.
I think Tolkien understands that because that's the tradition of Jews in general, but specifically in Europe before, during, and after World War II, is like traditionally Jews were not allowed to have the positions of power. So they were relegated to the positions that people didn't like, for example, banking. So then Jews were money lenders, and then everybody like, oh, the Jews control all the money. I hate that. And we're like, what do you mean? These are the only jobs we're allowed to have. And then, of course, we're kicked out.
Like Shylock from Shakespeare.
Exactly. Shylock is the quintessential Jew. And of course, because he's money grubbing, even when he says, if you prick me, do you not bleed? It doesn't. When you prick me, do I not bleed? Still, he comes out on the bottom, and he's still the antagonist of the story. So, to that end, that's exactly like it is in Lord of the Rings. The dwarves are super good at smelting and making weapons, but who are the ones wearing the armor, using the weapons to fight and get glory and be a hero? It's the elves, and it's fucking Aragorn. It's the humans. So they're relegated to being the support character and never really coming forward, which is very similar. That's the entire trope.
So something I do want to mention here is Tolkien did regret how he did the dwarves later on in life. He tried to go back and retroactively edit The Hobbit. He tried to edit later editions. That way it wasn't as bad as it was before. And he did regret doing some of the things that he did.
I feel like he did, but it's like he couldn't do anything. It's like, well, I already have this world. I guess I'm just going to keep going and try not to be as bad as I was. Which feels like, the modicum of change that so many showrunners and creators do is like, we're going to try to be not as bad, but still kind of pretty bad. It's like, all right, well, you could try. What I think is wild about all of this, and like if we were just talking about whatever fantasy series, fine. But the fact that this then became the palette of every single fantasy novel going forward is a bummer, because now it's like entrenched in our culture and people have no idea. I mean, again, like I said, the goblins in Gringotts in Harry Potter, again, explicitly Jews, pretty much going off of that same thing. Big noses, grotesque in so many ways, delegated to a job that's just in commerce. They have to work in Gringotts. They're the only ones who work in Gringotts, but of course they're not human wizards. They're still monstrous. And then going to Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, I spend so much time trying to decouple the ridiculous bullshit that comes along with the Monster Manual and the official Wizard of the Coast D&D canon. I mean, this is the fantasy racism that I'm sure you're going to touch on in different ways, but that's the same way that applies to so many minorities, because the fantasy racism, the fantasy stereotyping makes creating monsters easy. Like, that's why we're attuned to them, because we're like, oh, this tickles the part of my brain that's like, oh, I know this stereotype, I'm going to murder that thing, or I'm going to use them just for commerce and then move on. And I mean, and Wizard of the Coast, with all the things that they're botching, they are not going out of their way to help anybody do anything.
Yeah, the only thing that I can really think of that they've actually tried to change is in Curse of Strahd, the Romani coding in some of the people there.
Yeah, and like that's even just like Romani and like mostly gypsies there. It is set in Eastern European town, and like there is a dominating lord, which is very much a thing of like that's like all of the Yiddish story. That's exactly what all of the Yiddish stories in the early 1900s are about, where like there's one big guy and everyone else works underneath them. But like, yeah, they're like, oh, we're gonna get a Romani person to come in and look at it and make sure it's okay. But like, they haven't followed through on any of the other stuff that they've done. On the show, Join the Party that I do, we have like a section where we talk about like Dungeons and Dragons news, and I laid out all of the things that they've been doing since June 1st that they keep stepping in and like and intentionally ignoring the pleas and wants of all types of minorities. Like they still, they're not decoding any of the monsters from Dungeons and Dragons from their dark-skinned. Or dark-skinned means bad. They still have like cleavage everywhere. So many female coded monsters. They still have like those quote unquote Oriental, and actually no, the name of the module is called Oriental Adventures. That's still, you can just buy that. You can give them money for something called Oriental Adventures, and they they obviously don't actually care. It's just enough to be like, yeah, it is bad, just like Tolkien, who tried to make it a little bit better but didn't actually make big changes. Yeah, man. I mean, it's people don't realize this just came from one book. I think that like when you realize this came from a guy, I love Lord of the Rings. I love The Hobbit. I love these books, and I love the story that we're taking us on, but I'm so tired of the high fantasy genre because so many people are just continuing it and are taking it as confirmed. Like, it cannot change. Hobbits need to look like this, halflings need to look like this, tieflings and orcs need to look like this, dwarves need to look like this, and there's no one will look at it differently because they won't look at it. It's just the writing of one dude writing in one book and then deriving the entire genre from that. That's the thing that's bothering. It's like when someone tells you that you're doing a bad job, like when you realize that Tolkien needed World War II, the Holocaust, to evaluate his dwarves. Like, isn't that the fucking pinnacle of this? He needed the 6 million Jews to die to be like, hey, maybe I should I'm not going to make the dwarves not Jews. I'm just going to make them good. And that's like that's the pinnacle of everything we're talking about now.
I mean, just mentioning J.K. Rowling, like, as a queer woman, it is so difficult to just come to terms with the fact that J.K. Rowling's a big old turf when Harry Potter is such a big part of my life and is one of my favorite book series and has been such a positive influence on my life, and yet such negativity has come from the creator and the author.
That's even less because she did it out of canon. Like, someone just needed to take Twitter away from this woman. Like, she could have just been like a secret bigoted person like everybody else, but she really needed to tell us all of these things, and she needed people to affirm her, which is this turf shit is insane. This turf shit is so wild to think about that she needs to tell us that she doesn't think trans people are valid. Like, she could have just not shared.
Yeah, like, Tolkien didn't have to, like, come out and be like, hey, I made them Jewish. Isn't this cool?
Yeah. I think comparing these two situations is really interesting. Because, again, Jo wants to tell on herself real bad. She really wants everyone to know that she's bigoted, right? But, of course, we can't examine... It's so much harder to examine the work of someone who is passed away, obviously, but also it was like, oh, this was from the 60s, it's so old, like it's canon, we can't examine it and say that it was problematic. And what does problematic even mean now, but it's like, hey, we are acknowledging that we can change this and be better, but we need someone to repeatedly tweet and say that they're a bad person before the decoupling from Harry Potter is truly happening. Like, how many times did we hear the whistle, hear the suggestion that, I mean, listen, she had house elves. Like, she had all of these things. She had unchangeable houses that you could never change, and one was the racist house. Like we could have seen some of this stuff, but instead we needed, and that the house elves super wanted to work even when they're free. It's like we need someone to tell on themselves so much before we're like, hey, this person's bad, let's consider it. It's really tough.
It's an insane plot that has no resolution and comes off as just being like, okay, this is a thing, and now it's not a thing, and it doesn't matter, and bye.
I think what's interesting when we talk about fantasy is that we're living in a world where we can consider races other than humanity that are better or worse, right? Like elves are always good, orcs are always bad. And then we forget, because there are so few humans, or for when we're talking about Tolkien, we're like, humans are just kind of like figuring it out, like, and we then ascribe the person who writes that to the same absolute goodness. Like J.R.R. Tolkien might as well be an elf in so many people's eyes, because the work is amazing, it's perfect, the person who created this work is amazing and perfect. So
Tolkien actually viewed himself as a hobbit because of the whole British countryside thing.
Oh, that's right. Because he saw like the country people as just like hobbits. Here, let me try to explain that again. I feel like when we talk about fantasy lands, because there is so much world building happening, we see the author as kind of a god who has created a world that is infallible, that has no problems, because they have literally created something from scratch and then be like, this is my world, go forth. And the only other person we know who did that, for those who subscribe to monotheistic religions, all this stuff, is God above, right? So it's very hard for people, I think, to look at a fantasy work that has this much world building in it and be critical of it, because there is so much like literal from the ground creation. We don't know how to be critical of that sort of thing. So we're like, this is perfect, this is canonical, it can never change. I don't know why you're being critical of the thing that is perfect.
Yeah, sometimes it can just be really hard to just have such a love of these things and then find problems with it. It's trying to reconcile with your love of a fantasy book, of a world, while still recognizing that there is a problem.
And then, of course, there are the people who, if you say, like, oh, this isn't a good thing, they yell at you and don't want you to think about this thing too critically because it's perfect and the thing they love. So, yeah, hey, why don't you just... Don't make don't make Jews into monsters, guys. Just don't do it.
So Tolkien, he was saying that his inspiration for the dwarves really came from the Old Testament stories, where they were warlike and they were artificers and they were great jewelry makers and they were this powerful race.
Yeah, that's a really Christian thing to me. It's like the way that Christians look at the Torah. You know how people say like, oh, according to Judeo-Christian knowledge and stuff like that. It's like, well, Jews and Christians think really different things. That's the whole Jesus thing. It was that he was Jewish, then he was like, no, I want to do all of these other things, and then created a totally different religion. So I think it's the way that Christians look at the Torah and the Old Testament and be like, wow, so warlike, God came down so hard and punished people so much. Like, I love that. People forget. And also around this time, especially in the 1960s, this is all like, look at all those Jews going out into Palestine and turning it into Israel. Is like, or all those Jews I fought alongside in World War I and who were fighting against the Nazis in World War II. It's like you're trying to turn a stereotype on its head about a minority, because it's like, no, they're still a minority. They're some of the good ones.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because Tolkien really does do this whole search for the Holy Land in both books. In The Hobbit, it's the search to reclaim the Lonely Mountain and the treasures inside, which have been taken by this terrible monster, this dragon. And then in The Lord of the Rings, Gimli part of his mission is to find out what happened to an expedition where they were looking for this ancient city of Moria, this ancient land that is their homeland. And it's a little on the nose, honestly.
It's extremely on the nose, for sure. This is fun. This is all I truly want to talk about. This is great. I'm having so much fun.
Me too. I love this, honestly. So another thing that Tolkien really talked about was the fact that he made Dwarvish, the language, to be like Hebrew. He really wanted to, again, brag about the fact that he made the Dwarvish language so much like Hebrew. He's like, hey, isn't this neat? It's the same phonetically. It's this really interesting language. Isn't it so cool? Like, again, he wanted cookie points.
Yeah. That's an interesting thing too, because Hebrew was kind of a dead language for a while there, because it's only in the Torah, and then people didn't speak Hebrew until people brought it back in Israel in like the 70s. So yeah, lots of Jews spoke Yiddish, which was a derivative of German. So it was like a lot. That's what the Eastern European Jews were doing. And then of course the diaspora happened because of it. So it is also another romanticizing of quote unquote Old Testament Jews and the quote unquote ancient Hebrews, right? It's like they spoke Hebrew, which only is in the Torah, so it's this ancient language that I'm going to turn into Dwarvish, you know? So again, it's a more romanticizing of something that didn't exist at the time that he considered to be a dead language. It sounds like he's talking about Hebrew and not Yiddish.
That's interesting you mentioned that, because that is something that I found in my research was Tolkien had a interview, like I mentioned earlier, with the BBC, and something that they actually had to cut because they considered it too racy at the time was Tolkien kind of made this analogy where dwarves are like the Jews, where they have their secret language all their own, but they still speak in the mother tongue of the nations that they're in, but always with an accent. And that's just not great.
Yeah. It's like he's saying all these things that are true, but he wants cookie points for just acknowledging it. But like, this is your world, dog. You could have not done that. It's very funny considering someone, because this is what we really consider to be like modern European history. Someone who is living in that and then exemplified that through his fantasy story. Like he really wanted everything that we knew about Jews in Europe to stay in Middle Earth. And like, you didn't have to do that. You could have just done something else.
It's not okay. It's not okay.
It is. It's incredibly derivative. And like, not only is it like offensive that you're using my people's history in your fantasy book, but it's like, hey, don't rip my shit off. Like, do something else. Like, go be like C.S. Lewis and make a lion who's actually Jesus. Like, come on. You spent all this time trying to convert him to your specific sect of the same religion. You could have read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe instead. Go read Prince Caspian. Like, Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I mean, there's some problematic stuff in Narnia too, but that's for a whole nother podcast.
What I think is interesting when you compare those two is that I know also Tolkien has said he didn't want Lord of the Rings to be seen as an allegory, but everyone just kind of looks at it like it is. Like, it's not supposed to be World War II in a fantasy book, but at the same time, like, you done did it. Like, you still took all of these things from your world, which was because you were writing during the most tumultuous modern time in European history. Like, you still drew from your world, and people are going to think it's an allegory when you make the bad people around you bad, and the minorities around you the same minorities. And, like, the elves are going to be the pinnacle of Aryan race. Like, you know, you are drawing from your environment, so there's no reason why people wouldn't see that and being like, oh, I get that.
Yeah, like there's an entire part of the very beginning of The Lord of the Rings where it's talking about refugees trying to flee the southern areas and come to the Shire and go through the Shire to go to the west, and it's like, huh, that's not similar at all. Nope.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, I wonder what that's like in your life. If you're a hobbit and the place where you're from is like the countryside of the United Kingdom, I wonder what this is related to, huh?
So I guess my biggest question is, how do we reconcile the fantasy that we love, this material that we love, with the modern era and what we know now?
Interesting. I think twofold. One is when we read canonical works, we maintain a critical eye. Like as long we're acknowledging it and we know that it has problems, like living in ignorance is the first problem. For those who are going out and creating new things, I think it's about not relying on the minorities in your life when you are coming from a privileged position and then saying like, oh, you get to be the function, you don't get to be the hero, you're just kind of the sidekick, you are just the NPCs in my world. And if you're actually going to have a fellowship, everyone should actually have equal power, right? So I think that's what it comes down to. I mean, I can only speak to the Jews in fantasy books and in novels, and what I'm trying to do in Join the Party in the Dungeons and Dragons podcast that I run. I can't speak to I am an Ashkenazi Jew. I come from Eastern Europe, so I'm white, and I can only speak to as much. But elevating the stories of everyone. There's no reason why we need to hear the same stories from the same people, from the same country, and the same socioeconomic group, because obviously the people carry these biases, and like I want to hear stories from Black people. I want to hear stories from from East Asians and Asian Chinese people and Japanese people, and African stories and South American stories and all of that. I think it's about diversifying who we elevate and who we read and who we recommend, and then also keeping a critical eye on the canon, which is incredibly male and incredibly white and incredibly Christian.
Right, and that's exactly my goal of this bonus episode is I realize I do have white privilege, so I'm trying to use that privilege to uplift other voices.
Well, thank you. That's good to hear, and thank you for having me on. Truly, this is all I ever want to do is talking about stuff like this. So thank you for having me on.
So my last question is, can we still enjoy these things while still being critical of them?
No, I think that it's worth just being critical of. I mean, we're talking about high fantasy here and the tradition of that. But when you watch Star Wars, like Watto, the big alien who has wings and has the big nose, space Jew, in the same way that Jar Jar Binks is a space black person. So it's like, keep an eye out in all of your media, I mean, it's also interesting when you think about robots as well, because although robots have kind of been like sanded down and we only consider robots to be Asimov. Was Isaac Asimov Jewish? I can't remember. Asimov Jewish, question mark? Oh, he was. Yeah, he was. That makes sense. It's interesting to think about, like, even in science fiction, was like robots are a Jewish creation as well. It comes from the tradition of the golem, which is that you can create something that will defend you, and when you are in a tight situation, you can build something using your smarts and your wits that will defend you from enemies, because that's what Jews had to do for thousands and thousands of years. So I think it's also interesting to remember where so many tropes we consider come through. Do they come from Tolkien, who is a British guy from a very specific place that saw World War One and is this very specific kind of British guy? Or like, who has created these things that we find? Who has created these things, and what traditions are we following on? And should we be critical of them or remember where they're from? I think it's just thinking about.
All right, so thank you so much. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, that's it. Go listen to the podcasts. Listen to the podcast on Multitude. That's my day job. Thank you. I'm the Dungeon Master of Join the Party, but you should listen to all of them, which is Spirits, which is a mythology podcast, Potterless, where we take a look at Harry Potter from a grown man reading it for the first time. Horse, which is our basketball podcast, which is not actually about basketball. Next Stop, which is a sitcom that I wrote, but it's also a podcast, so it's modern and good and new. And just watch out for the other stuff on Multitude, and you can follow me on Twitter at EL_Silvero. That's my name if I was a Lucha Libre wrestler.
That is incredible. And I just want to say I listened to Spirits and Potterless, and they are incredible podcasts. I definitely recommend that everyone go listen to them, as well as the other podcasts that I hear are fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much. Hey guys, editing Evelyn here. So that was our first half of our bonus episode, and the second half starts now. So hey, it's Evelyn from Talking About It Again, and I am here joined by
Raven. Hello, and how do you do?
Hi. So I'm very excited. We just had another guest on talking about one issue, but we're here to talk with you about race coding in The Lord of the Rings. Tell me a little bit about your background with Lord of the Rings.
So for me, I grew up on The Hobbit as a kid and then watched Lord of the Rings as a movie numerous times. I also read the books when I was in, like, I want to say junior high school, at least a couple of times. But yeah, like there was always something that kind of niggled at me, and it came up again when they did all of the wonderful Tolkien movies. Like, I love Lord of the Rings, but I still had a lot of issues with it. But in a visual format such as a movie, it's actually a lot easier for me to put my finger on what was nagging at me so much.
Well, let's go ahead and dive into it. What was nagging at you?
So, like, the biggest thing about it was you didn't see any sort of real representation of people of color, especially, you know, like not Black people.
Because I guess I should mention you are a woman of color right now,
yes,
which is why you're qualified to talk about this.
Yes, I am a woman
I probably
of color.
Should have said that.
I am half Black, so yes, okay. I identify as Black. And I always wanted to see myself in fantasy, especially in, like, you know, fantasy roles, because there was always so many cool characters. But, like, you never saw people of color represented, especially not women, but especially not people of color represented as good guys in things as big as, you know, like, let's say Lord of the Rings. And it was always such a problem, because it was like, there's this wonderful, rich fantasy world. How is there no representation? And why do I feel like something is being, like, thrown at me? Yeah. But I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And it came down to the fact that the representation of people of color, especially my color, was always as the bad guy, as usually the servant class, so the orcs and the Uruk-hai.
Yes.
So yeah, it was the servant class, the cannon fodder, the irredeemable dark. Yes. And that was always given to scriptures that you would find given to people of color. So large, swarthy, slant-eyed, big, muscular, always seen as grotesque, and usually given a language that almost nobody else spoke. Yes. Especially not people who were considered high, mighty people of color. Even when you get into the wizards, when Sauron the White starts leaning into, Saruman the White starts leaning into his, you know, well, I think I'm just going to follow the Dark Lord on this one. It's like, Gandalf still found a way to try and talk to him and try and bring him back, because he was always seen as redeemable in some way. But when it came to the orcs and the Uruk-hai and anything of those dark, we are always seen as just plain out evil.
Yes.
And there was no redeemable quality to these creatures. And so the best thing to do was exterminate them.
Yeah, it's something that comes out a lot, is an us versus them type of situation. And I do want to mention early on that Tolkien, he very much tried to say, hey, don't try to read too much into this. This isn't what I was trying to do. However, in the modern era, and especially 2020 with what's going on right now in America, it's important to talk about it. yes, it was a different time, but in this modern age, we should definitely be allowed to look at it critically and say, hey, some things weren't great.
Yeah, well, and I think people, when they hear the word racist, they get really, really scared that it's that big letter R, which means,
Yes.
irredeemable, can't find anything good about this person. It's not the big R. Like,
Mhm.
okay, Lovecraft was a bigger R.
Yes, Lovecraft was big R
Oh,
racist. He was
oh
capital R
yeah.
racist.
Oh yeah, he was.
He was.
Um, Tolkien was a little R, and I don't think he realized a lot of his internalized bias. He was born in what is now South Africa,
Yeah.
and he was there till he was about 3 or 4 years old, I believe, and then he moved to Victorian England.
Yeah.
So he was kind of steeped in a lot of the implicit biases, the racial biases that you would see for people of color. They were not seen as being on the same level as, say, a Caucasian person, an English person. They were seen as a servant class. They were seen as lower than, less than, not human, and honestly, not very redeemable. Hence the reason all of the missionaries came over. Not so much to elevate them to level of person, but to show that they could redeem even the savage.
Right.
So, I mean, there's a lot of implicit bias that he had, and it did come through in his writing, especially with the way he decided to describe characters, and not just on the person of color side, on the elven side. The
Yes.
elves, like the most high elves, the ones who had the most power, who had the most standing, they were always described as golden haired, very fair skinned, always described as almost the Aryan ideal of white,
Yes.
basically.
Yeah.
So it wasn't, he may have said, oh, don't read too much into it, but
Right.
he kept putting it there. So it's like,
Yeah. The argument that across my own research that I've seen people say is that Tolkien, he was very, and this kind of comes more the talk we did earlier with the Jewish coding, where he sent a letter to Nazi Germany saying, hey, I'm not going to let you guys translate this into German because I don't agree with what you're doing. And so everyone's like, look, he can't be racist because of this one thing that he did. And it's
yeah.
like, maybe he wasn't, like you said, racist with a big R, but he definitely had these implicit biases because when you look at the orcs and you see the people that come to the aid of the Dark Lord are these Southern Islanders that are very dark skinned.
Yes.
And they are wearing turbans and cloaks and they are riding elephants. And it definitely comes off as this Victorian colonialism that you see where Sam is like, have you even seen this? No one back home will believe this, where it's like, that's what people wrote about when they were in South Africa, like he was, like when they went to India. So it's not just the dark skin, but it's just that other mentality of this classic Victorian white that he was so used to.
Yeah, I mean, the very fact that you had an entire army riding elephants. Yeah, get a good visual look at them in the movies or descriptions in the books. And yes, those are classic descriptors for Indians and North Africans. Yes. And it's like, yeah, there's not a lot of hiding behind that. If you had said, oh, they came in riding dragons or another mythological creature, then you might have been able to go, oh, okay, there's some ambiguity there. But no, he described the clothing that they wore, much like the Indians, much like the North Africans, and he described animals that pretty much, down to a T to the tusks, fit the descriptors of elephants, which were used as mildly domesticated animals. So it's like, it's not like you can just say that, oh no, it was all good and happy and fine. And it's like, no, literally the most savage of races he described in ways that very easily fit people of a lesser class for the Victorian era. I mean, you have goblins riding wolves, shooting bows and arrows.
Yeah. And that's something else, is the goblins are these little vicious underground dark little things that no one can understand, and they're not worthy of being understood. It's something that kind of comes along in both The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings is just no one even bothers to understand them. Not even Gollum, who is literally like scum of the earth, has been corrupted fully by this ring, won't even go near the goblins and bother with them.
Yeah, and I always found that kind of interesting in my mind, because Gollum used to be, like Bilbo, and like,
Yes.
he was a halfling, and yeah, he was scum of the earth because he let himself become corrupted by this darkness. But even he was seen as possibly redeemable, and they worked towards that. But yeah, like, he shunned to an extreme these others,
Yes.
and it was always, oh no, I'm better than, and they actually tried to work with him. I'm like,
yeah.
you're trying to work with him, but you can't try and work with these others. They are too corrupt, too weird, too strange, too out of bounds. And I mean, even in the movies, oh my goodness, even in the movies you see just the disdain for the other. And it's like, again and again and again and again. Oh crap.
Yeah. And some people might wonder, why does this even matter? It's one book. But let's be honest, Lord of the Rings has influenced fantasy culture as a whole. That's something that we just touched on in one of our regular episodes, is how influential these series are. Like, Harry Potter, Game of Thrones, Orson Scott Card, Stephen King, Earth Song series, just so many different stuff. Like the entire notion of the hero's journey, Star Wars, just all derived from this. Dungeons and Dragons is so problematic.
Oh yeah.
When you look at it too closely, and it's something that has influenced the world as we know it, which is why, again, I would argue it is critical to look at it with a closer eye and with the knowledge about this is what it is. So let's be aware of it.
Yeah, and I think that's like the key to it, is the fact that he is basically the father of modern day high fantasy.
Yes.
And that's also the problem with it, is he is the father of modern day high fantasy. And if you look through his books and if you watch all the movies, because it's a ginormous franchise that was
absolutely
wildly successful and tons of money was put into it, but you could practically count the number of times you saw a person of color on screen. And I had some major issues with the movie because of this. Anytime you see men, they are fallible, but in all in all, they are honorable, and just give them the right push and they will redeem themselves. When you see the high elves, they're always light and nice and floaty and doing their thing. And the only time you see people of color are the elephant riding army, and they're there briefly and almost thrown away. You're like, and it's like, okay, thanks. And then you see the Urukai, and here's the major sticking point for me. They didn't get a bunch of large football playing, rugby playing, white guys to play the Urukai. They specifically chose Maori to play the Urukai. They found large islanders and people of color to play the Urukai. It's almost like they went out of their way to represent the only representation of people of color being the bad guys. And like, all of the terror, all of the madness, all of the worst, grossest aspects you could possibly portray were always the people of color. And they were not, it wasn't just that they were vicious and cruel and evil, it's that they were pretty much dumb as rocks and could only take orders from the white people who created them. And it's like, oh god, there's so much subtext you almost don't want to read it, but it's there.
Because even Sauron comes from these Tolkien never says gods, but they're essentially gods, and they're all very white coated.
Mm-hmm.
And Sauron is the one that creates these. Even the Nazgul, several of the Nazgul are the darker skinned people from around the southern areas.
Mm-hmm.
That are corrupted and turned evil.
Mm-hmm.
You have the black horses that are purposefully bred and trained to hold evil. Like, yes, black and white is definitely some imagery, but it's a little too black and white sometimes.
Yes. Yeah, it's so on the nose that if you're just like, guys, seriously? Because like they could have used any other color. I mean, in both in books and in visual mediums such as movies and TV, there are different ways to represent feelings, actions, emotions, and give backstory. So they could have used greens, like those deep, kind of gritty acid greens. They could have used, deep ruddy purples or somewhat off reds and that kind of thing. They could have used a color story, but they quite clearly and repeatedly used black for evil, white for good, and there was only maybe a little bit of mixing in between. And it was just too on the nose all of the time.
Mm-hmm.
So like it came down to faces after a while. So even when you have, the Rangers, of course, were dark because they would move through the forest, as would the Wood Elves. But when they described the faces, it always came back to the same type of face, the same type of features that they remarked on. And it's like, when you're only giving us the same descriptors to tell us who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, you see a repeated pattern. So it's like, oh yes, look, hey, and look, these dark blah blah blah, turban wearing blah blah blah. And you're like, dude. And it's not like he did it once or twice. He did it throughout these stories, and they carried them over into the films, into the movies. So it's like it really became very, very apparent, and it carries into other genres, or it carries into other series and franchises and books and whatnot. I mean, if you go to like Game of Thrones,
That's exactly what I was gonna say. Game of Thrones. That's exactly where my mind went looking at the Dothraki.
Oh my goodness, yes. Thank
Yeah.
you. Anytime that you looked at the different cultures that were represented in Game of Thrones, because I swear to you, it's just an adult version of Lord of the Rings,
It
quite
really is.
honestly. Yeah, you had the Dothraki, who were dark, who were swarthy, horse riders with a kind of a gross cultural background that they love to go
Yeah.
over again and again and again. You're like,
Yeah. Very this is a clean podcast, so I'm gonna say sexist instead of the R word that I want to use that's not racism.
yeah, I know exactly which one you're talking about. And to watch how they foisted that upon a young white woman. And when I say white, she was white,
She
like
was white with white
white.
hair and purple eyes. Like she was the victim.
Yes, yes. Repeatedly, she was the victim, but she was also the savior. And it's like,
Yes.
really? Because any town that was brown that she showed up to, she freed them. She
She
made it so much
literally
better.
died and came back to life. Like full like Jesus style. It
It really was. But again, how the most vicious, the most mostly the worst of them, like the slavers. They
yes,
were always
the
the
slavers
dark
were
skin.
always dark.
When they went to, oh, I'm suddenly blanking on the city name, but like the Southerners were always dark skinned, and you almost never heard them mentioned or spoke of. You would see them briefly, and usually they were kind of overt with how they objectified white people, especially
Yeah.
really, really white people. So yeah, it was that carryover from how Tolkien treated the other or people of color to now. And it was like, only, even though when it came down to it, it was white people versus white people when you're fighting major battles,
Mm-hmm.
people of color were either an afterthought, a side note, or just something to be remarked upon, usually in disgust.
Right. It's like they're like in both Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones, the major players are the two white people going up against each other, using the minorities as cannon fodder. Like Cersei even says in season 8, which that's just a whole nother issue, when she's upset that she doesn't have war elephants. Um and that the Dothraki are just sent off first things against all the White Walkers, and then they just all die, and they're like the front lines of it. And it's like really, really insane thing in Lord of the Rings. They're pawns in the game.
Yeah, and wholly disposable. There is no love for them. There is no worried about their safety. There's just like, okay, fine, just make more of them. Go, throw. It's like, and especially in Lord of the Rings, that representation was the dark people were always on the side of evil. They were always on the bad side. I can't really remember any people of color or dark-skinned people on the side of good.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I am honestly drawing a blank of them being represented on Gandalf's side or with the elves. Or, like, I can't remember anybody of color who was notable that was there to help.
Right.
It was like, all these dark creatures coming from these dark countries, dark continents.
Mm-hmm.
Gee, I wonder where else we've heard that particular wording.
Especially in Victorian England.
Yeah. So it's like they're always subtly telling you where they're coming from and who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. But yes, always, if you are an other, you are simply a vassal or a disposable and part of the schemes of people who were actually in power who were white.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
So yeah, it was a subtle message, but it was definitely not one that was lost, especially growing up when I read these books. I mean, Hobbit was 1937.
Yeah.
And then you had like Lord of the Rings, it was like 1954, I think.
Yeah. So basically, World War II happened in between the two books coming out, and then Tolkien himself fought in World War One. So that as well was very much an influence on him. And in World War One, he fought on the French front. So he really only had the white versus white experience. So he did write from his own experience, but I don't think he realized that his own world experience was very limited.
Oh yeah. He honestly thought he was a good and worldly man, but when you honestly look at his sphere of influence of what influenced him, it was really narrow. It was very limited. I am, again, I'm not saying that he was the big R, but he had a lot of biases that he did not recognize.
Right.
And, of course, growing up and actually reading that, you're like, this seems really skewed, but it's entertaining, but it seems really skewed. I can't quite put my finger on it. Well, now I'm older and wiser and I can put my finger on it. Made it a lot easier after a while. But yeah, it's like, again, I love the books, but there's been so much influence because of his books that, I mean, I have been told that, I shouldn't complain that there isn't any representation really in high fantasy for people of color. And they're like, it's just never been done. Well, why not? Why can't there be people of color? Well, just, they can't be magical. I'm like, you have never, ever, ever been exposed to African mythology. You have never been exposed to Native American mythology. Like, there is so much amazing mythology out there. How can you tell me that I can't be magical, that I can't be fantastical?
Something that I always think about is Neil Gaiman's Old Gods. That's that's very good representation. That takes like one of the main characters is a god from Africa. And it's so good. And it's like, yes, things can be done. The main character is a Black man, and he's basically the savior of the old gods, essentially. Like, they can't last without him. So there is ways to do it. And that's, as a queer woman, I also have problems finding representation of myself in media. It's very difficult. And that's something that I always hear. It's just like, well, it's based in like medieval times and that wasn't a thing. I'm like, no, that's so Black people didn't exist. Gay people didn't exist in medieval times. You obviously have not read enough.
Right.
It's very frustrating, and that's why representation does matter, because people like us, we want to see that coming in. That's why, as a massive Harry Potter fan, I am in deep distress right now with J.K. Rowling turning out to be a total transphobe.
Oh my god, I mean, I loved the movies. I could not get myself through the books, but I loved the movies. But yeah, it was one of those things where I'm going,
yeah.
And I noticed quite often, because I'm also queer, I noticed quite often she was retroactive in how she would say, oh yeah, this person was totally gay. And it's like, you didn't say that with any amount of conviction.
Right.
Your wording is really suspect. I'm not feeling it. I'm not feeling it. And then, like, she's just, oh man, she's buried herself under the jail, as it were.
But that's something that I really respect about the fandom, is the fandom collectively went, okay, bye. It's ours now. We own it, and we are going to control it now. And that's been fantastic. Just seeing that happen.
Absolutely.
It just blows my mind that there's not more diversity in fantasy. Fantasy is magic. Like, you can't tell me that you can't have all this amazing magic going on with these rules of an antiquated society.
Yeah, honestly, I would love if we would shift our narrative a little bit more towards the Neil Gaiman side, because he did so much research, but he did such a fabulous and wonderful job with American Gods. And not only do you have a Black man as your protagonist of the story, you have a wonderful cast of African, Middle Eastern, Native American, Slavic, Norse. I mean, you get people from across the world. You get like religions and mythologies from across the world all into one story, and it is an amazing story at that. So how we're not getting more of that is just beyond me. But like, again, it's because people have taken their cues from, let's say, older fantasy or older high fantasy and gone, well, this is just the way it's always done, and these are just the descriptors of the characters that we have always, identified with. So I guess there's a difficulty relating to something that is outside the tried and tested norms of a story, which is a shame, but I'm so glad that these are actually being challenged now. I know that D&D was highly problematic for me, and I straight up told my DMs, I don't care what you think. There's got to be a way that people aren't just born evil. You can't just tell me all giants are evil. Really? Are they? Or are they just a little bit pissed off that you keep coming over and, knocking over their homes and blowing up their mountains and treading through their forest without even asking? Like, they could
I just talked about D&D with my last guest, but they've stepped in it a lot recently. They've said quite a few problematic things, and they keep saying, hey, we heard you, we're going to fix it. Where?
Yeah.
The only thing that they have done positively is they did announce that they're going to reevaluate Curse of Strahd, but that's the only thing they've mentioned that they're fixing at the moment. So we'll see what they actually do.
I'll say, and this is why I love like homebrews where it's either D&D or if somebody's doing a Lord of the Rings spin-off or anything like that. I love the homebrews where they go, you know what? Let's open these up a little bit more. If you want to play from this race, okay, let's go with it. Let's create a story. Let's do something new. And let's not keep going with the same old traditions, because the same old traditions are kind of messed up.
Yes.
So yeah, it's like we're having to make our own way forward. But it's really difficult when you have something that is deeply set, deeply rooted, has a lot of traction, and the genre has then been built off of it, much like Lord of the Rings. Love it, but it's problematic, and we need to be able to change the narrative, or at least expand the narrative to, look at things from a different angle instead of being told, oh, no, you can only be XYZ.
Right. On those lines, Lord of the Rings is in the process of doing an Amazon Prime show where they're going to be doing another live action.
Mm-hmm.
How can they help with diversity with that?
Honestly, the quickest way you can do that is by actually putting people of color in the series. Like, have some wood elves who actually have some wood coloring to them. Have people of color, if not in the forefront, at least in the background. Because if you never see somebody represented, then you tend to form a very narrow focus. So have dark dwarves, have dark elves, and when I say dark, I mean dark of skin color. Like, have them from different places. Hey, there's our other wood elves who are visiting from the south, and they have news of what is going on down there. Here in rides a whole troop of like elves on horseback who are beautifully dark skinned with beautifully braided hair that's been decorated and stuff. Give me some North African elves.
Okay.
Like, give me, especially when you're having reports from the south, or you're having information coming in from the southern countries where they wear turbans and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. If you're going to have somebody writing in from the south to tell you some new stuff, the only way you're really going to be able to integrate with that culture and not be noticed is if you have that skin color.
Yeah.
If you're just like, I'm really pale showing up to get news, they're going to be like, I
don't think you're from around here.
So I noticed the accent, among other things. So have people who are representative be in your show. That is like the number one thing to do. And it sounds counterintuitive, but also don't make note of it. Mm-hmm. Don't go, oh, these dark and swarthy elves are from the south. Just come in, have these characters interact as if you would interact with anybody else, and then go and do their thing or come along for the ride, but you don't have to go, oh, you're this from here. It's like, oh my God, no, why are you talking louder? You don't need to talk louder. You just need to do the thing. So
it's very, and that's very much what Tolkien did when it came to the dwarves being coded Jewish. Like, he basically bragged about it in an actual interview that BBC had to cut a little bit because it got a little too much. He's when the podcast comes out, listen to the first half when we talk about it. There's a few things that even BBC is like, okay.
Yes, he did get dicey now and again.
Yes, but it was a 1964 interview, and he's just like, isn't it cool that I made the dwarves Jewish? Isn't it cool that I made the dwarvish language like Hebrew? It's like he was looking for cookie points, and it's like, this isn't cookie. I mean, yes, for the time period where he was, yes, that's cookie points for having even any diversity in a white Victorian era fantasy novel. Yes, I guess there's some cookie points there, but in 2020, you shouldn't be asking for cookie points for doing the bare minimum.
Exactly. Especially with as much globalism as we have now. We are talking, you're on the East Coast, I'm on the West Coast. We are talking in real time to each other. So how how
I'm
we don't have more globalization within our fantasy realms or within
right.
our fictional realms is like, how?
I'm in a Discord group for another podcast, a Harry Potter podcast, where I talk very often with another person from Vietnam, and we're actually collaborating right now on like this random little art project, like purely just for fun. But it's like, yeah, we're able to do that even though we're literally across the world from each other.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what it is. Like in Tolkien's time, yeah, him living in South Africa for a little bit, that was extremely rare. But
Mm-hmm.
now it's not. I had a friend in college from South Africa when I was in college in Virginia. Like it's
Yeah,
it's
I mean,
it's a thing now.
I it's like I do a Twitch stream, and yeah, I've got people from around the world. I talk to people in England. I have people who are from South Africa. I've got people from around the world who I can talk to in real time. So I think as we globalize, the only way to really expand a genre and make it better is to actually expand a genre and include more people. Because if you just keep telling the same stories over and over again, they get really, really rote and really, really easy to predict. And you're like,
Yeah.
okay, I've had this before. It's
As a big
okay.
comic fan, that's something that I've been saying for years is I'm sick of the same, like, oh my God, the Joker's here. He's causing chaos. What do? Batman fixes it. Superman, oh my gosh, Lex Luthor, he's trying to take over the world. Superman stops him. Like,
How,
like,
how many decades can you do that for?
that's why I'm both literally and figuratively in love with the new Green Lantern, Jessica Cruz, because she is this amazing Latina superhero with anxiety. As someone with high anxiety, like I really love that. Um, and then
Mm-hmm.
her partner, Simon Baz, is a Muslim man who is very religious and is uncompromising in that, but it's actually portrayed in a positive way. And it's like, we can do better. We are doing better. Why do we have to just let Lord of the Rings, this new show that's coming out, why do we have to take a step back?
Yeah, yeah. Oh man, I've watched a couple of new things that kind of opened my eyes. And one of them is actually Project Power. It's brand new out on Netflix, and it's just a movie. It's still got some issues, but I love the fact that your main characters are Black.
Oh,
Your protagonist is Black. Your flawed sidekick character is Black. The person they're trying to save, ultimately, she is Black and very powerful in a very different way. And it's just like, oh, okay. They actually had a lot of people of color represented in that movie, and they also took the time to gently throw in there a bunch of different negative things that happened to people of color. And it's like, what? You actually historically know about these things and you're willing to admit them? Oh my God. So yeah,
yeah.
it was really great. And it's because they're not just looking at the narrative from the same POV that we've always had. They're starting to open it up. And I'm loving the new narratives. I'm loving the different narratives because it's not something I've seen before. It's not something I've experienced before, but it's so fresh and it's so wonderful, and it doesn't really leave anybody out. It just gives you something different to think about, and that's not a bad thing.
I think you would really like the new show Lovecraft Country that
I
came out.
need to see that.
Like,
I need to see that
I
so bad.
haven't seen it either, but just from the promos, again, it's a Black man who just got home from Vietnam, serving his country, but coming home to racism and the Civil Rights Act with literal racist Lovecraftian monsters, while also
Mm,
coming to terms with the fact that his favorite author, Lovecraft himself, was a racist, capital R. Um,
yeah.
and it's really great to see these stories being told. It's not the same old thing every time.
Hmm.
It's nice to have representation.
Exactly. Exactly. And honestly, the representation actually just makes things better because you can only look at something that's cis het white for so long before you're like, I've heard this story so many times. I mean, like, okay, I just found Letterkenny recently, and I was worried about watching it because it's a show about white Hicks in like Canada or Upper
Hmm.
Peninsula, United States. I'm pretty sure they're Canadian, but they actually do have Native American representation in there,
Hmm.
and they have gay characters in there, and they were far more progressive than I ever thought a show about Hicks was going to be,
Huh.
and I really enjoyed it. But it's like, when I'm looking for a new show now, I'm looking for either more diversity in the cast so I can get some like new perspectives and new POVs and the way things are done, or I'm looking for casts that are pretty much non-white, because it's like, it's nice and all that we've had your opinion for the last
Yeah.
100 years, but let's let somebody else take a chance, because maybe they have a different story that I haven't heard, or they have a different way of kind of looking at it, which is why I've enjoyed a lot of things like Chewing Gum, or Crazy Head, or some of the more black led or person of color led shows. It's a different POV, and there's more stories there. And honestly, I think if we're going to continue forward with good fantasy, we need to expand what mythology we're pulling from. It can't always just be Greek or Roman or white. And I
Mhm.
say white as a very narrow viewed white mythology.
Right.
Go deep Slavic, go to some of to the minority people, go to the Native Americans or the native Aboriginals for different places. Like, get some real good new mythology, because honestly, they go about it in a very, very different manner, and it becomes so much more interesting because it's new.
Mhm.
It's old, but it's new.
Because as a WASP myself, I'm very already tired of other WASP content. For those who don't know what WASP stands for, it's White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Even though I'm queer, I'm very white, so I get a lot of representation already. But it's something that it's nice to see representation otherwise. And that's kind of why I wanted to bring you and earlier Eric onto this podcast, because I realize I do have that white privilege. And so I want to use that privilege to uplift other voices that you might not hear often.
Thank you. And yeah, I honestly, I find it kind of funny because, okay, I'm a gamer, giant nerd. I've been gaming since I was like 5 years old. I'm 40
Awesome.
now.
Awesome.
So, but I've also been doing like tabletop games, arcade, online. I'm a giant nerd. I've always been a giant nerd. But when people see me, they're like, you're a woman. You must not. I'm like, no, no, no. Let me stop you there. Been reading comic books since 11. Been gaming since I was 5. This
As
is mine.
as a woman who works at a comic book store, oh, the toxic environment is real.
Oh yeah. And then, and then of course it always rolls out of my mouth that I'm also queer, and they're going, and I'm like, oh, Jesus, don't even start there, because I can end you.
Oh, I will, like, I can, this is obviously an audio format, so no one else will see it, but I have a Green Lantern tattoo. I actually had in college a man come up to me and say, "Hey, did you know this looks like the Green Lantern?" and sign. And I said, "Yes, it was on purpose." And he goes, "Do you know what that is?" And he started to explain to
Oh,
me who my favorite
oh,
character was. And it's like, this
oh.
is tattooed on my body. Do you not realize I know who that is? I obviously didn't tattoo it just for the heck of it.
Like,
Not being
sometimes you honestly have to wonder. But yeah, it's like,
and that's why I'm part of, I'll go ahead and plug the nonprofit that I volunteer with, the LGBTHQ, which is actually kind of how I met you. I met you through a friend of a friend of a friend who I met through that organization. I'll throw out a big shout out to Dax exclamation point. He's the one that ultimately connected us. Awesome drag performer.
mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's just I've been volunteering with them for the past, oh my gosh, 2 years now, and
Oh, wow.
it's been one of the most rewarding things of my life, just being in this like queer community where we're
Mm.
all very intent on diversifying nerd culture and providing a diverse space at comic conventions. And one of our very prominent members is Jay Justice. She is a amazing Black woman who she's a writer, a blogger, a producer. She does so many incredible things. Check her out if you have not heard of her. And we partner with BlurredCon every year, which is Black NerdCon in the DC region. And I went to my first BlurredCon last summer. Obviously, this summer got canceled, but I went last summer, and just seeing everyone else like feeling out of place was the best thing ever for me. If that makes any sense, it's just like,
yeah,
I'm the one out of place right now. Cool.
Honestly, growing up, I didn't know that there were other Black nerds. I grew up in a very predominantly white area, and I was one of the few nerds, and I was very much the only female and the only Black nerd on like pretty much all of my campuses. It wasn't until about 6-7 years ago that I happened to go to a school for my second degree and ran into a group of nerds, and they were almost all Black, Asian, and Latin. I'm like,
wow.
Oh my God.
That's awesome.
You guys are nerds like me? And they're like, yes, we're nerds. You're a nerd? I'm like, God, yes, I'm a nerd. And they're like, ugh.
Yeah.
So yeah, oh my God, actually finding out that there was a culture that I belonged to and that I had people that I could go, oh my God, did you see that thing? Oh, yeah. It felt so good to find a place where I'm represented instead of just being this weird unicorn over on the sideline that everybody's like, are you sure you belong here? I'm like, I know I belong here, but honestly, that's the millionth time I've been asked that question. I'm starting to worry.
I obviously I don't understand, but I have heard that before because my cousin is half Black as well. And she was very into anime and manga growing up. She still is, but she was very she grew up in a predominantly white area, and she still complains to me that people will say, are you sure you're not white all the way? And it's such an insult to her. She's very proud of her heritage, but liking those things was considered a very white thing back then, and she was always very self-conscious about that growing up. And it's like, I can't even begin to imagine what that must have felt like, because I felt out of place just being a female nerd, period. I can't imagine being a minority and also a nerd as well.
Well, basically, you just take female nerd and ramp it up by about 2-3 notches. There you go. Because it's like, oh, you're female and you're a person of color. Are you sure? I'm like, yes, I'm sure. Because not only it's like, oh my God, I love this genre because of, I like the storylines. It's very different. I like that there is other stuff being brought in because it's a lot of Japanese culture that's being brought in at that point. But it's also the fact that like they don't view Black people in a very positive light. So quite often Black characters were not drawn very flatteringly, to say the least. And when you pointed that out, they're like, oh, they just don't understand. I'm like, no, they understand. They understand because they've been exposed to a very particular type of rhetoric or knowledge about people of color. And guess who gave them that knowledge? Racist ass white people.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like it's one of those things that it's taken 20 years now to like start to really break that particular narrative apart and get it changed and get it upgraded. That's kind of why I'm hopeful, because a lot of millennials and Gen Zs are doing the work to make it more inclusive and make things more diversified. And instead of going, oh yes, this is our diversity hire, you're like, oh yeah, these are these people, and yeah, we'll mix a little bit of here, a little bit of there. Yeah, everyone works together. It's like, thank you. That's all I've been asking for. I know it's weird for a lot of people looking from the outside who are used to being very much fully represented, if not overrepresented in a genre, to see now different people coming in, other people coming in. I know it makes them nervous. That I think they're the biggest worry when I see people who are like, oh, I don't know if I like this diversity thing. They're worried that the others are going to come in and do to them what they did to us. And it's like, no, we're not trying to do that. We're trying to make new stories. We're trying to make better stories. We're trying to make integrated stories. So yeah, there's going to be ones that are going to be predominantly focused on a person of color and a person of color's, POV or their background. But we also want to make different, collaborations that are integrated so that you have people of color who are, Indian, Asian, African, Caucasian, high fantasy, low fantasy, whatever. We want the culmination. We want the collaboration. And honestly, that's the end goal, is the collaboration to make fun new stories where everybody's kind of in it and we all just exist in a world. And if we're going to find a villain, it's going to be the villain's actions that drive the story and not the villain's background, otherness that drives the story, which is where most of our problems tend to come from.
Yeah, because that's like the only timidness that I had with this is that it's not exactly a pleasant conversation to have. It's not something that's really nice to think about. Even though I thought it was very important, I was worried what our listeners might think. But ultimately, that's why I decided to do this, is because this is an important conversation, even if it's not very nice and clean to think about and talk about.
Mm-hmm. And dealing with that discomfort is honestly the only way to get past that discomfort and do better. I know a lot of times it is very difficult for white people to have to think about the misrepresentation that has been just part of the norm for so long, and have to deal with, we did kind of mess up. We did do these people a disservice by representing them this way. The only way to move forward, though, is to go, okay, we messed up. How do we make it better? And it's not always just, oh, we have to grovel and no, just do better the next go around. Like, do better. Admit that you did something wrong and then do better. Because if you just go, oh yeah, we did something wrong, and you continue doing that same thing again and again and again, you haven't made any progress. Okay. So yeah, it's like, don't worry about the half-hearted apology. Just go, yeah, we messed up. We owned that fact. Now let's do better and be inclusive and like actually talk to people of color. Talk to, it's like, hey, I'd really like to have a Native American character. Okay, talk to somebody who's Native American. Like, actually get their input, because they're going to give you a different POV. They're going to give you more information, better information, especially about how they would like to see themselves represented in a story. I'm sure no Native American wants to be explained for like the thousandth time as running around in a tiny loincloth with a feather in their hair carrying a bow and arrow. Like,
Yeah.
No. And same thing with, a Black person. I am so tired of the ghetto, streetwise, quote unquote type ex-drug dealer gangbang. Like, I'm so tired of that being the only narrative, because I'm looking at American Gods, perfect example right there. You have Shadow, who comes from kind of a rough background, but you also have Anubis, and you have I think it's the Ibis brothers.
Yeah.
And then you have Mr. Nancy.
Mm-hmm.
You have African characters who are exceedingly refined, well-spoken, very passionate, well-dressed, just, oh my God. Visually, I could just eat for days. Mm-hmm. And just, I love their stories because they are so very different than the 2 or 3 trope background that you tend to get for people of color. So, like, talk to us, get us in on the process, for the love of goodness, because that's how you make a better story that is better representation. Okay. So, diversity. Yeah, diversity in story. But yes, I have a lot of hope, because we are, instead of going with our stock and standard publishers for our stories, there's been a lot more indie comics and a lot more push for indie comics
Mm-hmm.
of all varieties. So you're getting to see a lot more wonderful queer stories, and you're getting to see more stories from different points of view, and you're getting to see more integrated stories where you have people of a variety of different backgrounds, talking, coming together, having conflict, working out that conflict. The whole thing is becoming so beautifully diverse and different. And it's okay if you're not always the center of the story, because at least in some of the stories you are going to be center. So it works. Share the pie. There's always going to be more.
Awesome. Any final thoughts, just kind of wrapping up with Tolkien, about Lord of the Rings? Any last words you want to say?
So, how to put it together? Tolkien had a wonderful idea in making Lord of the Rings. He made beautiful, beautiful artwork. There's still going to be implicit bias in that artwork, but that doesn't mean that that has to be the end all be all of the story. I think going forward, taking his wonderful ideas, taking the the skeleton of the story that has already been set up for us, you can put very different meat on the bones, as it were, and show a wonderful arrangement of diverse cultures and peoples without breaking what he originally set up. So I think there's so much room for so much improvement in the best ways possible. So that's what I got to say about Tolkien.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. At least I hope it has been.
Oh, I've enjoyed it immensely.
I'm glad. If people wanted to find you, where can they find your stuff? Go ahead and
So,
plug whatever you want.
woo! So you can pretty much find me on TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, and Twitch as Dame Red Bento. Come on over and find me. You can also go to my my Square site, which is dameredbento.square.site. That's my shop. I'm an artist. I do sometimes cooking. I do a lot of, clothing, all different kinds of stuff. And if anybody ever just wants to have a conversation with me, I love talking. I am a chatty Cathy, to say the least. But yeah, come on over, talk to me. I'm queer, I'm a woman, I am a person of color, and I love talking about all of those, because being able to have those conversations with people is actually how best to educate them and to move forward in a productive manner. So thank you so much for inviting me. I had an absolute ball.
I am glad. All right. Well, we will see you next time.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.